The morning of August 3rd, 1943, began like most mornings for Korvettenkapitän Werner Henke aboard U-517, cruising at periscope depth in the central Atlantic. His boat had been at sea for 32 days, hunting Allied convoys along the Gibraltar-to-Britain route. Henke was an experienced commander with 11 confirmed kills, and he understood his craft's strengths intimately. The Type 9C U-boat beneath his feet could dive to 750 feet, stay submerged for 90 minutes, and outrun most surface vessels when running on the surface at night. What Henke didn't know, as he scanned the horizon through his periscope that morning, was that an entirely new kind of war was coming for him. 300 miles to the northwest, a stubby, ungainly aircraft that German naval intelligence barely considered a threat had just taken off from the escort carrier USS Card. The Grumman TBF Avenger looked like a flying bathtub, heavy and slow, designed originally to drop torpedoes on Japanese warships. But the aircraft approaching Henke's position carried something Germany's Kriegsmarine had never encountered before, something that would turn the Battle of the Atlantic on its head in a matter of months. The weapon hanging in the Avenger's bomb bay weighed 680 pounds and measured exactly 7 feet long. American pilots called it Fido. German U-boat commanders would come to call it Der Lautlos Tod, the Silent Death. It was the world's first acoustic homing torpedo, and it was about to make Werner Henke's experience, his skill, and his boat's capabilities almost completely irrelevant. The U-boat war in the Atlantic during 1942 and early 1943 had been Germany's most successful military campaign. Admiral Karl Dönitz's wolf packs sent over 1,000 Allied merchant ships to the bottom, more than 6 million tons of cargo destroyed. American oil tankers burned off the coast of Florida. British grain ships disappeared in mid-Atlantic. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Germany was sinking ships faster than the Allies could build them. U-boats accomplished this through a proven tactical doctrine. They travelled on the surface at night, using their diesel engines to achieve speeds of 17 knots, faster than most convoy escorts. When aircraft forced them underwater, they relied on depth and silence. A U-boat could crash dive in 25 to 30 seconds, reaching 100 feet in less than a minute. Once submerged, the boat became nearly invisible. Allied aircraft, dropping conventional depth charges, had to visually spot the submarine's location, calculate its course and speed, and drop their weapons with perfect timing. The success rate for aerial depth charge attacks in 1942 hovered around 9%. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. German commanders knew these statistics. They knew that if they dove fast enough and deep enough, they would survive. The ocean was their shield, and the vastness of the Atlantic was their operational space. In May 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were lost, but this was considered acceptable because wolfpack tactics still produced results. Dönitz believed his submarines could starve Britain into surrender before American industrial production could overcome the tonnage losses. What changed everything wasn't a bigger bomb or a faster aircraft. It was physics, specifically the physics of underwater acoustics, combined with electrical engineering and proportional guidance systems. The Mark 24 torpedo, given the codename Fido to disguise its true nature as a mine, represented 17 months of development from initial concept to operational deployment. Bell Telephone Laboratories and Harvard Underwater Sound Laboratory began work in December 1941, racing against a problem that had stumped weapons designers since World War I. How do you make a torpedo that can hunt its target without human guidance? The Mark 24 solved this through elegant simplicity. 4 piezoelectric hydrophones arranged around the torpedo's midsection listened for the specific frequency of cavitation noise produced by submarine propellers, 24 kHz. When the hydrophones detected this sound, a vacuum tube processing system calculated the bearing to the noise source and adjusted the torpedo's rudders proportionally. The torpedo literally steered itself toward the loudest source of underwater noise within its detection range of approximately 1,500 yards. The weapon itself was stubborn and methodical. Upon hitting the water, Fido began a circular search pattern at a depth of 50 feet, later changed to 150 feet based on operational experience. It moved at just 12 knots, half the speed of a conventional torpedo, but it could search for 10 to 15 minutes before its lead-acid battery exhausted. A 92-pound warhead of HBX high explosive provided the killing blow, more than enough to crack a pressure hull. But the Mark 24's real power wasn't its warhead. It was psychological. A U-boat commander facing depth charges could maneuver, could alter course and depth, could try to sneak away once the attack ended. The attacking aircraft had to guess where the submarine would be seconds after the bombs fell. Fido didn't guess. It listened, adjusted, followed. The faster a U-boat ran its engines trying to escape, the louder it became, the easier to track. Slowing down extended the torpedo's hunting time. There was no evasion, only the mathematics of time versus battery life. The weapon entered service in March 1943, with the first production models delivered to patrol squadrons and escort carrier air groups. Security around Fido was absolute. Pilots were forbidden from using the weapon's actual name over radio frequencies. Avengers carried them internally in the bomb bay, invisible to enemy observation. If a pilot had to ditch, the torpedo's battery was designed to corrode rapidly in seawater, destroying evidence of the acoustic homing system. German intelligence knew American aircraft were sinking U-boats at unprecedented rates, starting in May 1943, but they couldn't understand why. The TBF Avenger that carried Fido into battle was itself an unlikely submarine hunter. Grumman designed the aircraft in 1941 as a torpedo bomber to attack surface ships. It was large for a carrier aircraft, with a wingspan of 54 feet that folded for deck storage. The Wright Cyclone engine produced 1,800 horsepower, giving the fully loaded aircraft a cruise speed of 145 miles per hour. Not fast, not agile, but phenomenally tough. Grumman built their aircraft like tanks, with redundant structures and armor protection that let Avengers absorb damage that would destroy other planes. For anti-submarine work, the Avenger proved almost ideal. Its large bomb bay could hold either depth charges, the Mark 24 torpedo, or combinations of both. The aircraft's stability made it an excellent platform for radar equipment. Modified TB-F1D variants carried ASB or ASD radar in underwing pods, allowing them to detect surfaced submarines at ranges of 30 to 40 miles. The three-man crew, pilot, turret gunner, and radioman bombardier could conduct searches that lasted 5 to 6 hours, far longer than single-seat fighters. Starting in mid-1944, the TBM-3 variant added hardpoints under the wings for high-velocity aircraft rockets, 8 of them, arranged in pairs. The HVAR, nicknamed Holy Moses by pilots, was a 5-inch diameter rocket with a 23-pound warhead that could punch through 4 feet of reinforced concrete. Against a surfaced U-boat's pressure hull, which was built for underwater pressure, not explosive impact, a direct hit from an HVAR could crack welds, damage diesel engines, or destroy the conning tower. But the rocket's real value was suppression. A salvo of 8 HVARs arriving at 950 miles per hour gave U-boat gunners approximately 2 seconds from launch flash to impact, far too little time to aim their 20mm anti-aircraft cannons accurately. The tactical combination was devastating. Radar detected the submarine. Rockets suppressed the deck guns. Depth bombs or the acoustic torpedo finished the kill. And the U-boat commander, who'd spent years training to fight surface escorts with hydrophones and depth charges, suddenly faced an enemy that attacked from the air with weapons that required completely different defensive tactics. By summer 1943, the United States Navy had refined a new operational concept specifically designed to exploit these capabilities. Hunter-killer groups. Each group centered on an escort carrier, usually a converted merchant ship with a small flight deck, operating with 4 to 6 destroyer escorts as screening vessels. These groups didn't escort convoys. They hunted submarines in areas where ultra-intelligence intercepts indicated U-boat concentrations. USS Bogue, USS Card, USS Kor, and USS Croatan became the names German commanders learned to fear. These escort carriers operated in the mid-Atlantic Gap, the area beyond the range of land-based aircraft where U-boats had previously operated with relative safety. Each carrier typically embarked 12 TBF Avengers and 9 F-4F Wildcat fighters, though the exact mix varied by mission. The Avengers flew continuous search patterns, using radar to sweep vast expanses of ocean. When they found a submarine, they didn't just attack and leave. They called in the destroyer escorts. They coordinated strikes. They stayed on target, forcing the U-boat to remain submerged until batteries depleted, and it had to surface, where aircraft and surface ships waited. The statistics from these operations told a story that Dönitz's staff found increasingly difficult to explain. USS Card's air group sank U-117 on August 3, 1943, using a Mark 24 torpedo. 5 days later, Card's Avengers sank U-664. 3 weeks after that, they destroyed U-847. All 3 kills used FIDO. All 3 happened in areas where conventional depth charge attacks had previously failed to achieve results. Commander Werner Henke aboard U-517 didn't know about acoustic torpedoes when he detected aircraft propeller noise through his hydrophones on August 3rd. His response followed standard doctrine: emergency dive, rig for silent running, descend to 400 feet, maintain slow speed on electric motors to minimize noise signature. This procedure had saved his boat multiple times during previous patrols. The aircraft would search, drop a few depth charges if they guessed his location, then depart when fuel ran low. Henke would wait 1 hour, then surface to recharge batteries and continue his mission. But the Avenger pilot from USS Card didn't drop depth charges. He dropped FIDO. The Mark 24 entered the water 200 feet from where Henke's boat had submerged. Its circular search pattern, 150 feet in diameter, brought the torpedo across U-517's track within 4 minutes. The hydrophones detected the boat's propeller noise. The vacuum tube guidance system locked on. The torpedo turned, accelerated to its maximum 12 knots, and began closing the distance. Henke's sonar operator heard it. A high-pitched whine, growing louder, unlike any sound he'd encountered before. Not the whistle of falling depth charges, not the thrashing propellers of a destroyer. This was something new, something wrong. Trying to outrun whatever approached. The U-boat surged forward, but the faster propellers generated more cavitation noise, a stronger acoustic signal. FIDO tracked the increase, adjusted its heading, maintained pursuit. At 412 feet depth, travelling at 6 knots, U-517 had no room to manoeuvre. Henke couldn't go deeper without exceeding the boat's test depth. He couldn't go shallower without surfacing into the waiting aircraft. He couldn't outrun a weapon that followed sound. The torpedo's warhead detonated against the pressure hull aft of the control room. 92 pounds of HBX explosive created a shaped charge that punched through 18 millimeters of steel and flooded 3 compartments in seconds. The boat didn't sink immediately. Henke managed to blow ballast tanks and emergency surface, evacuating the crew before U-517's stern section tore away and she went down. 33 men survived, picked up by the destroyer escort USS Baker. The interrogations that followed revealed something that Allied intelligence found remarkable. Henke had no idea what killed his boat. He described a torpedo that seemed to chase him, that followed his evasive maneuvers, that gave no warning before impact. The interrogators, bound by operational security, offered no explanation. Word spread through the U-boat service slowly at first, then with increasing alarm. Boats were being lost in circumstances that made no sense. U-160 went down on July 14th after an Avenger attack, with survivors reporting a weapon that tracked underwater. U-84 sank on August 24th, when a Mark 24 followed it through 3 course changes. U-220 went down with all hands on October 28th, leaving only an oil slick and debris field that suggested an underwater explosion far from where depth charges had fallen. Dönitz's headquarters received scattered reports from surviving crews, but the accounts seemed too fantastical to credit fully. A torpedo that steered itself? That hunted submarines by listening to their engines? German engineers had been working on acoustic torpedoes since 1933, but their designs targeted surface ships, not submarines. The idea that Americans had deployed a working anti-submarine acoustic weapon ahead of German development challenged every assumption about Allied technological capabilities. By September 1943, Kriegsmarine intelligence had compiled enough data to issue preliminary tactical warnings. U-boats were instructed to maintain absolute silence when submerged and under attack. This meant shutting down all non-essential systems, running on minimum electrical power, drifting rather than maneuvering. The theory was sound. If you don't make noise, acoustic homing can't track you. But the implementation revealed a fundamental problem. A submarine drifting in silence couldn't navigate, couldn't avoid obstacles, couldn't know what was happening around it. And eventually, it had to restart engines to maintain trim, to charge batteries, to regain mobility. The moment the propellers turned, Fido could acquire. German acoustics experts began analyzing the problem from first principles. If the Americans had acoustic torpedoes, there must be countermeasures. Several approaches emerged from the analysis. U-boats could deploy noisemakers, small devices that created cavitation sounds to decoy the weapon away from the actual submarine. They could experiment with rubberized coatings on the hull to absorb acoustic signals. They could modify propeller designs to reduce cavitation. All of these solutions required time for research, development, and deployment. Time that U-boat crews operating in the Atlantic in late 1943 didn't have. The psychological impact extended beyond tactics. U-boat commanders had always known their boats were vulnerable to aircraft when surfaced. That was accepted risk, managed, through lookouts, quick diving, and night operations. But underwater had been their sanctuary, the place where superior German engineering and crew training provided advantages over Allied hunters. Fido eliminated that sanctuary. It made underwater operations more dangerous than surface running. It inverted the entire tactical paradigm that had governed submarine warfare since 1914. Lieutenant Commander Howard Roberts, leading an Avenger from USS Card, described the new weapon's effect during a debriefing in September 1943. The Jerrys used to laugh when they dove. They knew we'd have to drop depth charges by guesswork, and the odds were in their favor. Now, when we put a fish in the water, they know something's coming that won't quit. You can hear the panic in how they maneuver. They're not trying to escape to a new position. They're just trying to escape, period. And there's nowhere to go. The tactical revolution represented by Fido became fully apparent in the final 4 months of 1943. Escort carrier air groups sank 17 U-boats using Mark 24 torpedoes. The weapon achieved an effectiveness rate of approximately 22% compared to 9% for conventional depth charges. But the raw numbers understated the impact. Every U-boat that encountered Fido and survived spread reports about the weapon through the submarine service. The stories grew in the telling, taking on mythological proportions. A torpedo that never missed, a weapon that could track a submarine for miles, a device that made diesel engines into death traps. German morale, already declining from increasing losses, took another hit. Experienced commanders began requesting transfers to surface warfare. Replacement crews arrived at U-boat training schools with diminished enthusiasm. The calculus of risk versus reward had shifted fundamentally. In 1942, a U-boat crew faced perhaps a 1 in 3 chance of dying during their patrol. By late 1943, the odds approached 1 in 2, and the deaths came from weapons against which there seemed no defense. Admiral Dönitz faced an impossible choice: pull U-boats back from the mid-Atlantic, concede operational space to the Allies, and accept that the convoy routes were now secure, or continue operations, accept mounting losses, and hope that new U-boat technology, the snorkel-equipped Type 21, could restore the balance before the submarine service collapsed entirely. He chose to continue, because stopping meant acknowledging defeat in the one arena where Germany had achieved consistent success. But the mathematics were unforgiving. In 1942, German shipyards produced 238 U-boats. In 1943, they built 270. The same period saw 105 boats lost in 42 and 247 lost in 43. The replacement rate couldn't keep pace with attrition. And every new boat sent to the Atlantic faced not just destroyers and depth charges, but escort carriers with Avengers carrying weapons that German commanders didn't understand and couldn't effectively counter. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The high-velocity aircraft rocket entered operational service in July 1944, adding another layer to the Avengers arsenal. Caltech engineers had designed the HVAR to replace the earlier 5-inch forward-firing aircraft rocket, which suffered from inadequate velocity due to its underpowered 3¼ inch motor. The HVAR used a 5-inch diameter for both warhead and motor, increasing propellant from 8.5 pounds to nearly 24 pounds of ballastite. The result was a rocket that achieved 1,400 feet per second velocity, producing the flat trajectory that pilots needed for accurate aim. 2 warhead variants reached service during the war. The Mark IV general-purpose warhead carried 7.5 pounds of TNT with nose and base fuses. The Mark 25 shaped charge semi-armor-piercing warhead used 7.5 pounds of composition B with an internal copper cone designed to punch through armor plate. Against submarine targets, either warhead was devastating. The shaped charge version could penetrate the conning tower's 18mm steel plate. The general-purpose warhead's blast effect could crack welds in the pressure hull or damage exposed diesel exhaust systems. TBM-3 Avengers carried 8 HVARs in pairs under the wings, in addition to their internal weapons. The tactical employment followed a specific sequence refined through combat experience. When an Avenger's radar detected a surfaced submarine, the pilot would approach at low altitude, typically 50 to 100 feet, to avoid early detection. At approximately 2,000 yards, the U-boat's lookouts would spot the aircraft and sound the alarm. The submarine needed 25 to 30 seconds to crash dive, during which its crew manned the anti-aircraft guns, usually twin 20mm cannons and a 37mm gun on the conning tower. This was the critical window. At 1,000 yards, the Avenger pilot would fire his rockets in rapid salvo, 2 or 4 at once, walking the impacts toward the submarine. The rockets' velocity meant they crossed the remaining distance in under 2 seconds. U-boat gunners, who needed 3 to 4 seconds to acquire and track the attacking aircraft accurately, found themselves under fire before they could respond effectively. The rockets didn't have to hit the submarine directly. Near misses created shrapnel that wounded exposed crewmen and forced others below deck, suppressing the anti-aircraft fire. With the deck guns silenced, the Avenger could make multiple attack runs, using its 50 caliber machine gun in the nose to strafe the conning tower and drop depth charges, or the Mark 24 torpedo with precision. The combination of rockets, guns, and guided torpedoes transformed the Avenger from a weapons platform that U-boats could sometimes fight into a weapons system that could destroy submarines through coordinated, overlapping attacks. The first recorded successful HVAR attack against a U-boat occurred on January 16, 1944, when Avengers from USS Guadalcanal damaged U-544 with rocket fire. The submarine, already wounded from depth charge attacks the previous day, was attempting to reach port when the aircraft found it on the surface. 8 rockets bracketed the boat, killing crew members on deck and rupturing fuel tanks. When U-544 crash-dived to escape, it left an oil slick that destroyer escorts followed for 6 hours, until the boat surfaced again and surrendered. Throughout 1944, the combination of HVAR suppression and Mark 24 acoustic homing produced kill rates that far exceeded previous years. American escort carrier groups operating in the Atlantic sank 54 U-boats during the war, with 31 of those kills attributed directly to carrier-based aircraft. The British, using similar hunter-killer tactics with their own escort carriers, accounted for additional sinkings. Together, shipborne aircraft and their surface escorts destroyed 93 German submarines in the Atlantic, fundamentally altering the strategic balance in what had been Germany's most successful military campaign. But the numbers tell only part of the story. The real transformation was psychological and operational. By mid-1944, U-boat commanders operating in areas covered by escort carrier groups faced an impossible tactical situation. Surface running invited immediate rocket and strafing attack. Crash diving meant potential pursuit by acoustic torpedoes. Remaining submerged on battery power meant limited operational range and eventual surfacing in areas where aircraft maintained continuous patrol patterns. Every option led to detection, and detection increasingly led to destruction. The tactical reports arriving at U-boat headquarters in late 1944 painted a picture that Admiral Dönitz could no longer ignore. Patrol after patrol returned with accounts of aircraft that seemed to possess supernatural hunting abilities. Submarines that dove successfully still ended up destroyed. Commanders who followed every evasion procedure in the manual still lost their boats. The pattern was unmistakable, but the explanation remained elusive to German intelligence until autumn 1944, when the first solid evidence finally emerged. On October 15, 1944, U-1229 was operating off the coast of Newfoundland when Avengers from USS Bogue located it on the surface. The submarine crashed-dived successfully, reaching 150 feet before the first weapon entered the water. What happened next was recorded by the destroyer escort USS Hayter, which arrived on scene minutes after the air attack. Hydrophone operators aboard Hayter heard something unprecedented, the high-pitched whine of an electric motor, followed by the sound of that motor changing direction, then accelerating, then the unmistakable crack of an underwater explosion. U-1229's stern section blew out. The boat corkscrewed toward the surface, shedding debris and oil. The destroyer escorts opened fire, but the submarine was already finished. 26 crew members evacuated before it sank. During their interrogation, the survivors described a weapon that had hunted their boat through multiple course changes, that had closed on their position despite their best efforts at silent running. One engineering officer specifically reported hearing the torpedo's motor through the hull before impact, describing it as unlike anything in German naval experience. The intelligence report from this sinking, combined with similar accounts from earlier survivors, finally gave Kriegsmarine analysts enough data to understand what they faced. The Americans had deployed an acoustic homing torpedo, probably air-launched, that used passive hydrophones to track propeller noise. The weapon was slow but persistent, patient but deadly, and it had been operational for more than a year before German intelligence confirmed its existence. The delay in recognition had cost the U-boat service catastrophically. By the time Dönitz's staff understood the Mark 24's capabilities and began developing countermeasures, American production had already delivered nearly 4,000 units. Pilot training programs at naval air stations across the United States had standardized FIDO employment tactics. Escort carrier air groups had refined coordination procedures between aircraft and surface vessels. The weapon wasn't experimental anymore. It was routine, just another tool in the anti-submarine arsenal, as common as depth charges and just as readily deployed. German engineers proposed several technical countermeasures during the final year of the war. The bold device, a canister that released calcium hydride to create a cloud of hydrogen bubbles, was meant to confuse acoustic sensors. Some U-boats received rubberized coating called alberich, designed to absorb sonar and hydrophone signals. New propeller designs with reduced cavitation characteristics entered limited production, but none of these solutions addressed the fundamental problem. The Mark 24 didn't require perfect acoustic targeting. It just needed to detect noise above a threshold level, and even the quietest submarine made enough sound to be tracked once the torpedo closed within detection range. The practical result was that U-boats operating in waters patrolled by escort carriers faced a no-win scenario. Every tactical option carried unacceptable risk. This wasn't like fighting destroyers, where experience and skill could improve survival odds. This was mathematics, physics, and industrial production overwhelming individual capability. A U-boat might have the best commander in the Kriegsmarine, the most experienced crew, the most advanced equipment. None of it mattered when an Avenger dropped a weapon that would hunt that boat for 15 minutes without human guidance. Lieutenant John Ballantyne, flying from USS Card in March 1944, described the almost clinical efficiency of these attacks during a post-mission debrief. You get a radar contact at 30 miles. You close to visual range, maybe 4 or 5 miles, and you can see the wake if they're moving fast. They'll always dive when they see you. That's doctrine. So you mark the swirl, make your approach, and drop the fish about 200 feet from where they went under. Then you just circle and wait. Sometimes you hear the explosion through the water. Sometimes you just see the oil come up. But you know it's working down there, hunting, and there's nothing they can do except hope their batteries outlast the torpedoes' hunting time. They usually don't. The cold professionalism in Ballantyne's description reflected a broader shift in how American naval aviators approached anti-submarine warfare by mid-1944. The early war period had been characterized by frustration, by depth charges that missed and submarines that escaped. Pilots felt they were fighting an enemy they couldn't see with weapons that didn't work. But by 44, with FIDO and HVAR in their arsenal, with radar and sonobuoys providing accurate targeting data, the psychological dynamic had reversed completely. Now the U-boat crews felt helpless, while American pilots approached missions with the confidence of surgeons performing routine procedures. This psychological transformation extended throughout the escort carrier groups. The hunter-killer concept, initially controversial within the Navy's senior leadership, had proven itself beyond any reasonable doubt. USS Bogue's Air Group alone sank 13 U-boats during the war, the most successful single escort carrier record. USS Card destroyed 11. USS Card accounted for 9. These weren't lucky shots or fortunate encounters. These were systematic hunting operations, conducted with intelligence support, modern technology, and tactics refined through repeated combat experience. The operational pattern became standardized across all Atlantic escort carrier groups by spring 1944. Ultra-intelligence intercepts would identify an area of U-boat concentration, usually a patrol line Dönitz had established to intercept convoys. A hunter-killer group would be vectored to that area, typically arriving within 24 to 48 hours. The escort carrier would launch continuous search patterns, with Avengers flying rectangular boxes that swept hundreds of square miles per sortie. The search aircraft carried radar, sonobuoys for detecting submerged submarines, and full weapons loads. When an Avenger made contact, it would immediately report the position to the carrier, which would vector additional aircraft to the area and order the destroyer escorts to close at flank speed. If the submarine was surfaced, the first aircraft would attack with rockets and guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire, followed by depth bombs or acoustic torpedoes. If the submarine had dived, the Avenger would seed the area with sonobuoys, establish an acoustic track, and drop FIDO to pursue the submerged target. The destroyer escorts would arrive to provide persistent prosecution, using their own sonar and depth charges to maintain contact until the submarine surfaced or was destroyed. This coordinated approach produced extraordinary results. During the 6-month period from April to September 1944, escort carrier support groups accounted for approximately 60% of all U-boats sunk by United States forces in the Atlantic and Mediterranean. The submarines weren't just being sunk at high rates, they were being hunted down and destroyed in areas where they'd previously operated with relative impunity. The mid-Atlantic gap, once a sanctuary, had become a killing ground. The strategic implications rippled through the entire German war effort. The U-boat campaign's primary objective had been to sever Britain's maritime supply lines, to starve the island nation of food, fuel, and war materials. By late 1944, This objective was not only unachieved but had become unachievable. Allied merchant ship construction had far outpaced losses. Convoy routes operated with minimal interruption. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 proceeded without significant submarine interference, despite dozens of U-boats being positioned to attack the invasion fleet. Admiral Dönitz, confronting these realities in his headquarters at Berlin, faced the collapse of his entire strategic concept. The Type 21 U-boat, with its revolutionary underwater performance and snorkel technology, represented Germany's last hope for restoring submarine effectiveness. But development delays, bombing of production facilities, and raw material shortages meant these advanced boats wouldn't reach operational status until 1945, far too late to affect the war's outcome. Meanwhile, the existing force of Type 7 and Type 9 U-boats continued to be destroyed at rates that made long-term operations mathematically impossible. The human cost on the German side was staggering and largely ignored by history's focus on surface warfare. Of approximately 40,000 men who served in the U-boat force during World War II, 28,000 died. That's a 70% casualty rate, the highest of any military service in the war. These weren't just casualties inflicted during the desperate final months. The bleeding started in May 1943, when aircraft equipped with improved radar and better weapons began finding submarines that had previously operated invisibly. It accelerated through 1944 as escort carriers and acoustic torpedoes eliminated even the most skilled commanders. The survivors' accounts, documented in post-war interviews and memoirs, reveal the psychological trauma of fighting an enemy you couldn't see using weapons you couldn't evade. Oberleutnant Herbert Werner, who commanded U-230 and survived multiple patrols, described the terror of being hunted by aircraft in his memoir, Iron Coffins. He wrote about the moment when you're submerged, running silent, and you hear through the hull the sound of an aircraft engine overhead. You don't know if it's seen you. You don't know if it's already dropped weapons. You just wait in darkness, listening to your own breathing, knowing that at any second a torpedo you can't outrun might be closing on your position. Werner survived the war, but many of his contemporaries didn't. The casualty lists from late 1943 through 1945 read like a toll of an entire generation. Experienced commanders who'd survived years of combat died in minutes when their evasion tactics failed against weapons that didn't follow the old rules. Young crews on their first patrol never made it home, killed by technologies their training hadn't prepared them to face. The TBF Avenger's role in this destruction was central and undeniable. Of the 35 submarines sank by American escort carrier air groups, most kills were made by Avengers using either Mark 24 torpedoes, depth charges, or combinations of both weapons. The aircraft's long endurance let it maintain contact with submarines for hours, preventing them from surfacing to recharge batteries. Its stability made it an ideal bombing platform. Its toughness allowed it to absorb anti-aircraft damage and complete missions. And its versatility meant a single aircraft could perform detection, attack, and battle damage assessment without requiring multiple specialist platforms. The Royal Navy's Fleet Air Arm, operating similar anti-submarine operations with British-built Avengers designated as Tarpon Mark 1 through 3, achieved comparable success. British escort carriers operating in the Atlantic and Arctic sank additional U-boats using tactics adapted from American hunter-killer doctrine. The weapon systems were essentially identical. Avengers with radar, depth charges, and acoustic torpedoes, supported by destroyer escorts with sonar and hedgehogs. The results validated the approach regardless of which nation's flag flew from the carrier's mast. Beyond the direct combat effectiveness, the Avengers' operations forced fundamental changes in how naval warfare was conceived and conducted. Pre-war doctrine had assumed aircraft were supplements to surface vessels, useful for reconnaissance and occasional attacks, but not primary strike platforms. The Pacific War's carrier battles proved aircraft could sink battleships and win fleet engagements. The Atlantic U-boat war proved aircraft could also hunt submarines, a mission previously considered the exclusive domain of destroyers and corvettes. This doctrinal shift influenced post-war naval aviation development across all major navies. The United States Navy continued refining carrier-based anti-submarine warfare throughout the Cold War, eventually deploying specialized ASW carriers with dedicated submarine hunting air groups. The Royal Canadian Navy operated modified Avengers well into the 1950s, fitting them with increasingly sophisticated sonar and magnetic anomaly detection equipment. Even the Soviet Navy, studying American successes, developed its own carrier-based ASW capabilities, recognizing that aircraft provided detection ranges and response, speeds that surface vessels couldn't match. The Mark 24 acoustic torpedo's legacy extended even further into naval weapons development. The concept of fire and forget homing weapons, proven in combat by Fido, influenced every subsequent torpedo design. The Mark 27 Cutie, adapted for submarine use against surface vessels, saw service in the Pacific from mid-1944 onward. Post-war developments produced the Mark 37, Mark 43, and Mark 46 torpedoes, all incorporating acoustic homing with progressively more sophisticated guidance systems. Modern anti-submarine torpedoes, like the Mark 54, still use descendants of the proportional navigation algorithms that Bell Telephone Laboratories pioneered in 1941. The high-velocity aircraft rocket enjoyed similar longevity. HVAR remained in United States Navy inventory until the mid-1960s, seeing extensive combat use in Korea. The weapon proved equally effective against North Korean and Chinese bunkers, tanks, and supply columns as it had against German U-boats. The rocket's flat trajectory and heavy warhead made it suitable for any target requiring precision strikes from aircraft. More than 1 million HVARs were produced before manufacturing ended in 1955, a production run that reflected the weapon's versatility and reliability. When the final German submarine surrendered in May 1945, the Battle of the Atlantic was already long over as a meaningful contest. The statistics told a story of complete Allied dominance. In 1944, U-boats sank 132 merchant ships, totaling 667,000 tons. This compared to over 1,000 ships and 6 million tons sunk in 1942. The reversal wasn't due to fewer U-boats being deployed. Germany actually had more submarines operational in 44 than in 42. What changed was Allied anti-submarine capabilities, particularly the deployment of escort carriers, with Avengers carrying weapons that made underwater operations more dangerous than surface running. The human story behind these numbers involved thousands of individual encounters, each one a life-or-death struggle between submarine crews and aircraft crews. But the aggregate pattern was unmistakable. Technology, industrial production, and systematic tactical development had combined to make German submarine operations untenable. The U-boat commanders who'd laughed at early war Avengers, who'd considered the slow, ungainly torpedo bomber easy prey for their anti-aircraft guns, had learned a bitter lesson. Superior weapons don't require superior performance characteristics. They just require effectiveness, and the combination of 8 HVAR rockets plus a Mark 24 acoustic torpedo delivered effectiveness that no amount of U-boat crew skill could overcome. The irony was profound. Germany had entered World War II with the most advanced submarine force in the world, built on 2 decades of secret development and training that circumvented Versailles Treaty restrictions. German commanders understood underwater warfare better than any other navy. German engineering had produced submarines that could dive deeper, stay submerged longer, and operate more reliably than Allied boats. All of this expertise and technological advantage became irrelevant when faced with weapons specifically designed to exploit submarines' unavoidable vulnerabilities. A submarine must make noise to move. That noise can be detected and tracked. Once tracked, the submarine can be attacked with weapons that follow the noise source. The physics are simple, elegant, and inescapable. German attempts to develop counter-tactics, to create noisemakers and acoustic decoys, to coat hulls with sound-absorbing materials, all represented efforts to work around fundamental physics. Meanwhile, American industry produced 4,000 acoustic day torpedoes, trained thousands of pilots to employ them, and deployed dozens of escort carriers to carry those weapons wherever U-boats operated. The Battle of the Atlantic, more than any other campaign in World War II, demonstrated the importance of systematic problem-solving supported by industrial capacity. The Allies didn't win because they had better submarines. They won because they developed better ways to find, track, and destroy submarines, then produced those capabilities in quantities that overwhelmed German countermeasures. The TBF Avenger, carrying HVAR rockets and Fido torpedoes, was the weapon system that made this victory tangible, that turned abstract strategic concepts into sunken U-boats and saved convoy routes. For the U-boat crews who faced these weapons, there was no honor in the dying, no glory in the struggle. They drowned in darkness, crushed by water pressure, or suffocated as air ran out, killed by enemies they never saw, using technologies they didn't understand. Some boats simply disappeared, marked only by their failure to make scheduled radio reports. Others left oil slicks and debris fields, anonymous graves in the mid-Atlantic. A few surfaced to surrender, crews evacuating before their boats were scuttled, choosing captivity over certain death. The Avenger crews who inflicted this destruction felt satisfaction at mission success, but rarely celebrated individual kills. By 1944, sinking a U-boat was routine work, dangerous but methodical, more like a difficult job performed correctly than like glory in combat. Pilots would mark their targets on radar, follow doctrine for weapon employment, and report results to the carrier. Then they'd fly another patrol, search another sector, hunt another submarine. The work continued until there were no more submarines to hunt, until Germany surrendered and the Atlantic finally fell silent. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The legacy of this campaign echoes through every modern naval force. Submarines remain powerful weapons, but they operate knowing that aircraft equipped with sensors and guided weapons can find and destroy them. The sanctuary of the deep, the invisibility that made submarines so effective in the early 20th century, has been compromised by technology that turns a submarine's engine noise into a beacon. The acoustic torpedo, the radar, the long-range patrol aircraft, these are the tools that ended submarine warfare as Germany practiced it in the Atlantic. And it started with an ungainly aircraft that looked like a flying bathtub, carrying a torpedo that German commanders laughed at until they understood what it could do. By then, it was too late. The laughter had turned to silence, the kind of silence that comes when a pressure hull ruptures at 400 feet and the ocean rushes in. The Avenger and its weapons didn't just sink U-boats. They sank an entire strategic concept, proved that technological adaptation beats rigid doctrine, and demonstrated that in modern warfare, the side that learns fastest and produces most wins the war that matters. The German U-boat commanders who'd dismissed American capabilities, who'd believed their superior training and better boats guaranteed success, discovered the hard way that wars aren't won by what you start with. They're won by what you learn, how quickly you adapt, and whether your industrial base can produce the weapons your tactical innovations require. By all those measures, the Allied anti-submarine campaign represented complete victory, and the TBF Avenger, with its rockets and acoustic torpedoes, was the weapon that delivered that victory, one submarine at a time, until the Atlantic belonged to the Allies, and the U-boat threat that had nearly strangled Britain was nothing more than a memory and some oil slicks on an empty sea.